Who was Burt Munro? Burt was a New Zealander, best remembered for his remarkable motorcycle world records he set at the Bonneville Salt Flats. In the 9 times he raced at Bonneville, he set 3 world records. On his debut in 1962, he broke his very first world record when he was 63 years old. His next one was 4 years later, and just 1 year after that in 1967, he broke his last world land speed record at the grand age of 68 years. This record of 184.087 miles per hour still stands today. In a nutshell, I guess you could say that Burt was a fanatic motorcyclist, obsessed with pushing his motorcycle, a 1920 Indian Scout, similar to the one pictured here, far beyond the limitations of its original design. At that time, people probably thought he was just a crazy old motorcycle racer who lived in a shed. I don't really know. But what I do know is that he must have been a very determined, resourceful and courageous man. Burt's accomplishments were little known outside of the motorcycling fraternity, but in 2005, when the movie about him, The World's Fastest Indian, was released, he became a household name. Director Roger Donaldson and his team did a superb job of compressing all of Burt's record-breaking attempts into a movie which you can watch in just 2 hours. I absolutely love this movie, and if you haven't seen it, it's a must-watch. In fact, Sir Anthony Hopkins liked the movie script so much, he accepted a fraction of his usual fee to portray Burt. In the city of Invercargill, they even have a larger-than-life bronze statue of him sitting in his streamliner.
Where do you hail from? Where's your hometown?
Invercargill.
How do you spell that?
Invercargill.
Gill.
I generally spell it with one
New
L.
Zealand?
Save ink.
New Zealand.
Yeah.
You can even buy models of Burt and his Indian. By all accounts, if Burt was alive today, he just wouldn't have believed what all this fuss was about. There's a misconception that Burt's Indian was a 1919 model Scout, and that he just called it a 1920 model because that was the year when he purchased it. In fact, Indian never made a 1919 model year Scout. They started manufacturing the brand new Scouts in September 1919, and it made its sales debut in October 1919, but they were all released as model year 1920. This is no different to what all manufacturers do today. So Burt was indeed 100% correct in calling it a 1920 model because it was. Burt's bike was one of the very first built. It was manufactured in October 1919 and it was a 627th Scout built by Indian. His original Scout had an engine capacity of 596 cc's and produced 11.5 horsepower, which was quite high for that time period. When Burt got the record in 1967, his bike was out to 953 cc's, and by the time he had finished modifying his Scout, it was out to a whopping 985 cc's in capacity and produced around 100 horsepower. The actual power the bike produced is a moot point. The 100 horsepower figure was rounded from a calculation done for Burt. I believe this figure was 98.7 horsepower. How it was calculated nobody seems to know, as the bike was never put on a proper dyno. His Indian motor was at best pretty fragile and needed rebuilding after every few runs. Burt himself reckoned he suffered something like 250 engine blow-ups of one kind or another in total. Originally his Scout's top speed was 55 miles per hour, yet on one of his runs at Bonneville he was clocked at an unofficial top speed of over 200 miles per hour. Over time, Burt heavily modified the Indian and he began calling it the Munro Special in 1933. As by this time he felt he had modified it sufficiently to dispense with the Indian nameplate. He added a front drum brake. He changed the front suspension from leaf springs to a girder type setup, although he used a leaf spring suspension for all of his record-breaking attempts at Bonneville. He also made the bike longer and dramatically lower. He changed the original total loss oil lubrication system to a dry sump system. For the uninitiated, a total loss oil system means just that. Any used oil is basically just burnt in the engine or dumped onto the ground. This was pretty common on early motorcycles. Even so, the exposed rockers and the ends of the push rods still needed to be lubricated regularly by hand. He also shaved an enormous amount of weight from the bike. But the most innovative modification he did was changing the engine from the original side valve twin cam configuration to an overhead valve 4-cam configuration, a major change in anyone's terms. About the only thing he never modified were the transmission gears. Considering the extremely hard life the bike had, they held up amazingly well, and is a testament to how well the old Indian motorcycles were made.
Why do you like going fast though?
Well, who doesn't? Everybody breaks the speed limit, don't they?
The gearing on his Indian was extremely high. He would have to slip the clutch until he reached about 50 miles an hour in first gear, then change into second at around 100, and finally third or top gear at around 140 miles an hour. What is not widely known is that in the early years, Burt's bike served many duties. He used to attach a sidecar to it, which of course was homemade, to transport his family around while living in Australia in the late 1920s. He would then strip the bike down and go racing on the weekends. Then later, back in New Zealand when his family grew to 4 children, too many for the sidecar, he made a 2-wheel trailer which he towed behind the bike for his kids to ride in. You'll notice in these early photos that the Indian still had the original leaf spring front suspension and no front brakes. One of Burt's children, his son John, cherishes early childhood memories from around 1940 when occasionally he would get taken to school on his dad's bike. Little did he know at that time that the bike would go on to become world famous and his dad would become a motorcycling legend. The Indian was never mollycoddled. For 5 decades it had an extremely hard life. All of the parts were made by hand, in Burt's own shed and on a shoestring budget. Yet after all the hard riding and abuse that the bike endured, this very same bike still managed to break a world land speed record 47 years after it was first manufactured.
You can live more in 5 minutes in a motorcycle in some of these events I've been in than some people do in a lifetime.
It's a fallacy that Burt was sponsored at Bonneville. He absolutely refused to accept any sponsors. However, he did accept aid, but most of the aid he received was in kind. You can see here on the tail fairing of the streamliner the words, "Assisted by Pierce Indian." Sam Pierce gave Burt free storage for his bike and allowed him to use his workshop to work on his bike prior to taking it to Bonneville. Although Sam quite often portrayed himself as sponsor of the Munro Special, this was a claim that Burt intentionally refuted. The assistance he received was nothing that warranted the term of sponsor. In fact, all of his innovations, modifications and achievements were due to no one else but Burt himself. It's another fallacy that Burt made 4 different streamliner shells. His first streamliner shell he made was hammered from aluminium and took him 5 years to manufacture. But it was too hard to ride, too neat to fit, and he had a lot of trouble changing the gears. So he modified it, and then he used it as a mould to make his second streamliner shell from fiberglass. This was the first streamliner that he used at Bonneville in 1962, and it had a tri-fin tail. This is the one the movie was based on. He also manufactured a canopy for the streamliner, but Burt found it claustrophobic and he never used it. After his successful 1962 debut at Bonneville, he returned to New Zealand with the Indian and proceeded to modify his fiberglass streamliner to improve stability, literally slicing it in half, making it longer with a single and much larger tail fin. He used this modified streamliner at Bonneville from 1963 right up until his last and final modifications in 1967, when he basically just cut a hole in the nose cone, for reasons which I won't go into, along with a few other necessary modifications. So, in fact, Burt made 1 aluminium shell and 1 fiberglass shell, which he later modified twice. And this brings me to the most controversial misconception of all. Where is Burt's original record-breaking bike now? America or New Zealand? When people see photos or video of this particular bike, they think that it is a replica bike or a copy. Burt's very good friend Sam Pierce was an Indian agent in California. After his first few trips with his bike to America, Burt started leaving his streamliner on frame at Sam's after competing at Bonneville, as shipping the complete bike was way too expensive. But he always brought his original record-breaking engine and gearbox back to New Zealand to work on. After Burt and later Sam both died, nobody had any idea where his streamliner was, as that information was never passed on. What happened to the bike or who had it has been a contentious issue for many years. After literally doing hundreds of hours of research, I discovered a prominent motorcycle collector at that time, Lyle Parker, had acquired the bike. Then by a stroke of luck, I unearthed an old video, which was filmed in 1979, 1 year after Burt died. you will see Burt's somewhat neglected, yet original and fully intact streamliner hanging up in Lyle's own motorcycle museum.
Okay, this machine hanging on the wall started its life as a 1920 Indian Scout. It was purchased by Burt Munro of Invercargill, New Zealand. And Burt rode the machine for a number of years on the street and used it. Well, it was just the only transportation that he had for a few years. Then he became involved in racing, and over the years this has evolved into a racing machine. Not racing on tracks or anything, but strictly for high-speed runs. And Burt would bring the machine over to the Bonneville Salt Flats every year for the Bonneville Speed Week. And his goal, of course, was to try to set a 200-mile record, 200-mile-an-hour record with this motorcycle. Many of the pieces that he made himself, such as the pistons, the rods, he made the rods himself, and they're really a work of art. They're polished to the nth degree. The 15th annual National Speed Week at Bonneville, it was the fastest motorcycle on the solid. It turned 183.673 miles an hour. It ran last in 1971, and Burt was 71 years old when he ran it last. The sticker, the Bonneville sticker, is inside the cowl. It has little clip-on bars that are just attached to the forks, and they're very short, called clip-on bars. It has a butt pad in the back, which is similar to a cultivator seat, and you sit in a crouch, a kneeling position, and you can see from the angle of the windshield that he had to be almost lying down. He was looking at it at a very sharp angle. After he ran last in 1971, they wouldn't let him run anymore because of his age, insurance, and so on. So he decided to dispose of the machine and went back to Invercargill, New Zealand, and he passed away there in a year ago, January. He was a very fine old fellow, and wherever he is, I hope he's doing at least 200 miles an hour on an old Indian.
So there you have it. Burt's original record-breaking streamliner, the original frame and wheels, were still in America 1 year after his death. This bike, however, had Burt's spare Bitzer engine, which he installed when he flew back to America to sell the bike in 1975. It was modified somewhat, but not to the specs of the original record-breaking engine. The bike later resurfaced and was also later immaculately restored. Although it's difficult to comprehend nowadays, in the late 1970s the Munro Special was just a beat-up old racer, and it wasn't that interesting to motorcycle collectors of the time. Have a listen to this audio clip from 1971, with Dick Rosetta from the Salt Lake Tribune interviewing Burt at his very last appearance at Bonneville. In Burt's own words, you will hear him say that the bike at Bonneville that very year has his original 1920 Scout frame.
You still operate with the same chassis?
Yeah, that's the original frame on my bike. Did you see it over there? Yeah, I've modified it a lot.
The bike never returned to New Zealand after that year. The original record-breaking engine and gearbox is definitely in E. Hayes & Sons Invercargill, but it actually sits in a different Scout frame, which Burt modified in the late 1960s. He did this so he didn't have to keep dismantling his other race bike, a Velocette, to install the Indian motor in its frame for testing in New Zealand, as he had to do in the past whenever he left the streamliner in America. So you see, there really are two Munro Specials. They both lay claim to record-breaking status, and both were built, modified and were ridden by Burt himself. There were, however, two replica bikes built for the movie The World's Fastest Indian. One of these is in Invercargill, the other one I believe is situated in Christchurch. However, since the film was made, other replicas have been built for display purposes. How many I do not know. Burt's streamliner in America is a part of motorcycling history, and I have no doubt it's worth a substantial amount of money. But if I owned that bike, I would give it back to the Munro family in New Zealand, because that's exactly where it belongs.